When people think of Michael Jackson, the king of pop, they often think of his classic hits, his legendary moonwalk dance, and his immense fortune. But behind that glamorous image lay enormous debt, $500 million never publicly disclosed, and financial ruin that lasted until the end of his life. Today, I will expose how a man who made billions of dollars fell into such deep debt. Watch until the end. You will discover why his $2.5 billion empire today was built on a foundation of near bankruptcy. The fall. Michael Jackson died on a Tuesday of the 25th of June 2009 morning in a rented mansion nobody remembers the name of. He was 50 years old. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, had given him propofol, surgical anesthetic, to help him sleep. It killed him. 3 weeks before that, Jackson had announced 50 shows at London's O2 Arena. Tickets sold for $85 million worth in days. People were losing their minds. After everything, the trials, the exile, the tabloids shredding him, he could still pack a stadium. That told you something about the grip he had on people. But here's what nobody knew while they were buying tickets. Jackson was physically wrecked. 50 years old, but moving like someone much older. The rehearsals were intense, grueling. His body was barely holding together. The warning signs were everywhere, if anyone had been looking. His weight had dropped to dangerous levels. Friends reported he was skeletal, gaunt, barely recognizable. His skin had become increasingly pale and paper-thin. He had chronic insomnia that required pharmaceutical intervention just to sleep a few hours. His energy levels during rehearsals would spike and crash erratically. Medical personnel on set noted he'd have moments of confusion, disorientation. His voice, the instrument that had defined his entire career, was becoming strained, inconsistent. He developed a persistent cough. His hands trembled during choreography. He was on multiple medications, painkillers for his deteriorating joints, stimulants to keep energy up, sedatives to force sleep. His personal physician, Dr. Murray, was essentially running a pharmaceutical operation out of his dressing room, yet Jackson pushed harder. The comeback represented everything: redemption, financial salvation, vindication, proof that he still mattered. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant admitting defeat. Stopping meant the creditors would win. Stopping meant he was just a washed-up former star, not the king of pop. So he ignored the physical collapse. He pushed through the pain. He demanded more from his body than any 50-year-old could physically deliver. The irony was brutal. The very performance that was supposed to save him financially would destroy him physically. When the lawyers and accountants got into his books after he died, they found something that didn't make sense. $500 million in debt. $500 million owed to banks, lawyers, financial advisors, creditors spread across dozens of accounts. By his death, he was losing $30 million a month. Think about that for a second. A man who'd earned $2.1 billion in his lifetime, whose total pre-tax earnings, inflation adjusted, hit $4.2 billion, who could make $100 million a year in his prime, dead broke. In the early 2000s, Jackson had taken out a $380 million loan from Bank of America, put his Sony ATV stake up as collateral. The interest alone was tens of millions annually. He just spent it all. Within a few years, the entire $380 million was gone. By 2002, he had $130 million in cash, but $415 million in debt. He was borrowing against assets that were already stressed, spending money that wasn't there. Then the second round of allegations hit in 2003. 2 years of trial, tens of millions in legal fees. He was acquitted in 2005, but something broke in him after that. He said he'd never go back to Neverland Ranch, left the place, never returned, moved to Bahrain, lived as a guest in someone else's home. By 2008, he couldn't pay a $23 million loan to Fortress Investment Group. Foreclosure on Neverland was scheduled. Auction going forward. He had no money. Tom Barrack, billionaire, Colony Capital, stepped in and covered it. Jackson signed the property over to a joint venture, took $35 million, and lost the one place he'd built as a refuge from the world. The man owned billions of dollars in assets and couldn't access any of it. By early 2009, something shifted. Maybe desperation. Maybe he actually believed he could still pull it off. He announced a comeback tour, 50 shows, London's O2. $85 million in tickets sold almost immediately. Even destroyed, even buried, even owning nothing, Michael Jackson could still move people. He rehearsed for 3 weeks straight, pushed his body. His physician managed his sleep with drugs, and then his body gave out. On a Tuesday morning, in a house he was renting, in a city where he was a stranger. Michael Jackson died trying to escape debt by making money the same way he always had, by being Michael Jackson. It didn't work. The genius that built an empire. To understand how someone dies a half-billionaire in the red, you have to go back to 1982. That's when Thriller happened. The album sold 66 million copies. Didn't just sell, it changed how the industry worked. MTV had been pretty much white. Thriller made them put black artists on rotation. The videos were in the cinema. People lined up to see them. By the mid-80s, Jackson was making $50 to $100 million a year. His tours sold out stadiums before tickets went on sale. Pepsi paid him $5 million in 1983 for an endorsement deal, first time anyone had gotten paid that much for that. Coca-Cola turned him down because they saw it as a targeted ethnic campaign, their loss. But Jackson wasn't just collecting checks, he was watching, thinking. He had dinner with Paul McCartney at some point. McCartney explained something Jackson apparently hadn't fully realized. You don't get rich making music, you get rich owning it. McCartney was pulling $40 million a year from publishing rights alone. This was the critical moment. Most artists never understand this distinction. They think wealth comes from performing, from selling albums, from touring, from endorsements. They chase short-term revenue, but McCartney was explaining a completely different wealth architecture: ownership. Every time someone played a Beatles song, McCartney earned money, in perpetuity, across the entire world, forever. He didn't have to perform, he didn't have to record, he just had to own. The mathematics of ownership versus performance are staggering. A world tour generates $100 to $200 million, but it lasts 6 months, and then it's over. Publishing rights generate $40 million annually and compound year after year, decade after decade, century after century. A touring artist has a 20 to 30-year window before their body wears out. A catalog owner has infinite years. Your children inherit publishing rights. Their children inherit publishing rights. The revenue stream becomes intergenerational wealth. Jackson listened, actually listened. In 1984, ATV Music Publishing went up for sale, owned 4,000 songs, including more than 250 Beatles tracks. Every major hit the Beatles ever made. McCartney was offered a shot. Yoko Ono was offered a shot. Both said $40 million was too much money. Jackson offered $47.5 million. Closed the deal in 1985. At 25 years old, a pop singer just outbid a Beatle to own the Beatles' music. The industry didn't know what to make of it. McCartney apparently didn't forgive him for it. But it was the smartest move of his career. He proved it worked in 1987 by licensing Revolution to Nike for $500,000. Purists lost their minds. A Beatles song selling sneakers. Jackson didn't care. He understood publishing rights were a machine. In 1995, Sony offered him $95 million to merge ATV with their catalog. Suddenly he owned half of something much bigger. Between 2005 and 2013, Sony ATV grew to own over 2 million songs: Eminem, Lady Gaga, Akon, everyone. By 2012, it was generating $1.25 billion in annual revenue, $500 million in profit. His original $47.5 million investment had become a multi-billion-dollar asset. He also owned MyJack Music, all the songs he'd written, Billie Jean, Beat It. That catalog alone threw off double-digit millions annually. So Jackson was sitting on a financial empire, 2 separate multi-hundred-million-dollar assets, cash flowing in constantly. He was untouchable. The question was, what would he do with it? Drop a comment. If you were advising Jackson after that Sony merger in 1995, seeing what you know about his spending habits, would you have let him keep control of the money or forced restructuring? The fantasy that ate everything. Jackson bought Neverland in 1988 for $20 million, 2,700 acres in Santa Ynez Valley. Then spent another $35 million turning it into something that shouldn't exist. A Ferris wheel on your property, a carousel, a roller coaster, a pirate ship ride, a zoo, a train station, a working railway with a full-size locomotive, a 12,000 square foot mansion, 3 guest houses, a theater that seated 200, a lake you could boat on. He named the train station after his mother, Catherine, had the train conductor announce arrivals like it was an actual station, built this world where the normal rules didn't apply. Elizabeth Taylor got married there. Oprah did her interview there. He hosted a World Children's Congress where kids from around the planet lived at his theme park for 3 days. It was extraordinary. It was also a financial black hole. Maintaining a private amusement park costs money constantly. Staff salaries, electricity for all those rides, insurance, maintenance on the Ferris wheel, the roller coaster, the zoo animals, landscaping on 2,700 acres year-round. This wasn't a house with a big backyard. This was an operating business that happened to be someone's home. Beyond the park, Jackson's personal spending was just excessive. He had limousines with gold accents, Rolls Royces with bars inside. He walked into an antique store in 2003 and allegedly spent $5 million in a few minutes, just pointing at things and saying, "I want that." Bruce Lee statues, paintings, collectibles he'd never display. His lifestyle, the travel, the jewelry, the shopping, Neverland's operation, cost $30 to $50 million per year, minimum, which was fine when he was earning $50 to $100 million annually, tight but manageable. The problem, it never stopped increasing. By the early 2000s, the income side started shrinking. The 1,993 allegations had damaged him. Newer albums didn't hit Thriller numbers. Tour revenues flattened. Endorsement offers dried up. Touring got harder. But Jackson didn't cut spending. He couldn't cut spending. The lifestyle wasn't optional. It was who he was. So he borrowed, then borrowed more, spent that money, borrowed again. The machine had one setting, forward, and it was accelerating toward a wall, the implosion. By 2002, Jackson's balance sheet was a disaster. $130 million in liquid assets, $415 million in debt. The math didn't work anymore. He wasn't just broke, he was deeply, systematically insolvent. Then, the second set of molestation charges in 2003 changed something fundamental in him. 2 years of trial, millions in legal fees. When he was acquitted in 2005, he wasn't celebrating. He was done. He said he'd never live at Neverland again, and meant it. Just left. The place was empty. He moved to Bahrain, lived as a house guest of a Saudi prince. The man who'd owned the world's most exclusive theme park was now staying in someone else's mansion because he couldn't afford his own property. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Jackson had gone from controlling a 2,700-acre kingdom to being a dependent in someone else's home. He had no agency, no privacy, no refuge. He was living on someone's charity despite owning billions of dollars in theoretical wealth. The humiliation was profound. He couldn't access his assets because they were all locked up in Sony ATV, in MyJack Music, in partnerships and trusts and structures. The money was there, but he couldn't touch it. It was like being wealthy while homeless. The isolation intensified everything. He was separated from his children, separated from what remained of his family, separated from the American entertainment industry, separated from the world he dominated. He was a ghost in a foreign country, watching his empire collapse from across the ocean. Reports from people who saw him in Bahrain described a man who was barely present physically there but mentally absent, as if the trial and exile had shattered something core in him. The debt continued accumulating. Each month, the interest on his loans grew larger. Each week, creditors sent new notices. The financial firms holding his debt colony capital, Fortress, Barclays, were getting nervous. The financial firms holding his debt colony capital, Fortress, Barclays, were getting nervous. By 2008, Jackson couldn't make payments. Foreclosure notice on Neverland, auction scheduled, public sale of everything. Tom Barrack from Colony Capital stepped in and covered the $24.5 million, but the price was controlled. Jackson signed the property over to a joint venture, got $35 million out of it, money he immediately needed just to keep functioning. He'd purchased Neverland for $20 million, spent $35 million renovating it, and effectively lost it to creditors. The dream was gone. By 2009, he was hemorrhaging $30 million monthly. Lawyers, advisors, bills he couldn't pay, debts accumulating faster than any income could cover. The empire was collapsing in real time. But then something happened. Maybe he realized this was his only way out. Maybe he needed to feel like Michael Jackson again, needed the stage, needed the validation. Whatever it was, in March 2009 he announced a comeback. 50 shows at London's O2. This is it. The announcement alone generated $85 million in ticket sales, sold out immediately. People wanted to see him one more time, so he rehearsed intensely. pushed his 50-year-old body through choreography that would kill someone half his age. His physician kept him sedated so he could sleep between rehearsals. He was trying to outrun the debt, to earn his way out the same way he'd earned his way into everything else. 3 weeks in, his body quit. It's worth asking, was he trying to save himself? Or was he already broken and just didn't know it yet? What's your take? Was the comeback a last-ditch survival attempt? Or did he know something we didn't and needed to perform one final time? Comment below. The impossible resurrection. Everyone expected a fire sale, assets liquidated, catalogs sold to the highest bidder for pennies. The Jackson empire dismantled and scattered. That's not what happened. Jackson's lawyers, John Branca and John McClane, the executors named in his will, didn't panic. They didn't sell under distress. Instead, they did exactly what Michael had always done. They thought like owners, not victims. They sold future music rights to Sony for $250 million, produced a documentary, This Is It, that made $260 million at the box office, highest earning documentary ever. Suddenly, the estate had nearly $500 million in cash without touching the catalog. This was the critical, strategic decision. Instead of liquidating Sony ATV, the crown jewel of Jackson's empire, at distressed prices, they kept it and built around it. They understood that Jackson's true wealth wasn't in the money he had lying around. It was in the assets that generated perpetual revenue. Branca and McClane made decisions Jackson himself never could. They said no to emotional purchases. They said yes to boring partnerships. They treated the estate like a business, not like the personal playground Jackson had treated his finances. They negotiated partnership deals with Cirque du Soleil, long-term Vegas shows, merchandise rights. Pepsi came back. A Broadway musical, MJ, became the biggest theater hit in years. In 2016, they sold Sony ATV's 50% stake to Sony for $750 million. That year alone, the estate earned $825 million, Forbes' highest single-year celebrity earnings ever recorded. The difference between Jackson's approach and Branca, McClane's approach, was night and day. Jackson saw wealth as something to spend. Branca, McClane saw wealth as something to multiply. Jackson bought the Ferrari. Branca, McClane sold the Sony ATV stake at optimal market conditions. Jackson said, "I want that." Branca, McClane said, "What generates passive income?" This wasn't cold or heartless, it was survival. It was the difference between the estate becoming a $2.5 billion enterprise and becoming a cautionary tale about a bankrupt celebrity's heirs fighting over debts. They negotiated partnership deals with Cirque du Soleil, long-term Vegas shows, merchandise rights. Pepsi came back. A Broadway musical, MJ, became the biggest theater hit in years. In 2016, they sold Sony ATV's 50% stake to Sony for $750 million. That year alone, the estate earned $825 million, Forbes' highest single-year celebrity earnings ever recorded. Since 2009, the estate has generated over $2 billion. Today, it's valued at $2.5 billion. The thing most people don't understand, Michael Jackson didn't die poor because he couldn't make money. He died poor because he spent money. But he died owning things, catalogs, rights, intellectual property that kept generating value even after he was gone. Was he a trillionaire? No. Nobody in history has been. He wasn't even demonstrably a billionaire during his lifetime based on liquid assets. But he was something else. A man who burned billions, owed $500 million, and still left an empire that generates more wealth than most musicians will see in 1,000 years. The scale was everything. The scale of the earnings, the scale of the spending, the scale of the debt, the scale of the collapse, and finally, the scale of what came after. He lived like money was infinite, spent like the music would never stop. And he was right. The music didn't stop. It just outlived him. The tragedy isn't that he died broke. It's that the system that saved his legacy, the one based on assets and ownership, not on earnings, was available to him while he was alive. He just never used it. Everyone expected Michael Jackson's estate to collapse. Fire sale. Catalogs liquidated. The empire dismantled. It didn't. His lawyers sold future rights to Sony, produced This Is It, partnered with Cirque du Soleil. Today it's valued at $2.5 billion. 3 critical lessons. The genius to ruin pipeline. Jackson built a $2 billion asset through brilliant thinking, then destroyed his liquidity through irrational spending. Wealth creation and wealth management are completely different skills. The exponential spending trap. His lifestyle demanded $30 to $50 million annually. When income dropped, he borrowed. When borrowing maxed out, he had nowhere to hide. The posthumous resurrection. The estate survived because it controlled assets, catalogs, rights, IP that kept generating revenue. Even in death, those assets worked. Lesson: control systems, not just income. If this exposes something about wealth and control, like and subscribe to Wealth Dominion. We decode the financial empires most people never see. Thanks for watching.